Ratzinger says, no, this God who is revealing himself to Moses and the Israelite people, he's not just a God of some place. He's a God of men. He's a God of your fathers. He's a God who exists in relationship with you and your people and who transcends time and space, but can nevertheless enter into relationship with you.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Deacon Max.
This is Deacon Joey.
And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about a work that Joey has been working on over the last, really 2 years, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been thinking about this. Really, it started my first year of theology, so it's been kind of in the works the last 3 years.
I think we could also say that this is something that's maybe been on your heart since you entered seminary. I think that's fair. I mean, most works, which we're talking about, his thesis, his master's thesis, which means that there's at least some desire from early stages of your philosophy and theology in this subject. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So, really, yeah, it's kind of a culmination of a lot of the different things I've been interested in during my time in seminary. Like you said, the philosophy studies at first and then theology. Really, the inspiration for it was I took an elective my first year of theology on the thought of Joseph Ratzinger and was just reading him over and over and over again. Our listeners all know that you and I both love Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and have been formed so much by his thoughts. So that's kind of what was the inspiration for the paper, and just putting the finishing touches on it now, so almost done with it. And Deacon Max, you actually had the idea that maybe it'd be cool if we got to share what we've been working on, So
well,
I'm excited
the real
to do
reason
that.
I proposed that is because, I mean, obviously my thesis is more interesting than yours. And so I figured this could be a good way for me to present mine and along the way present yours. So thank you for being that project of mine.
Yeah, hey, no problem. I love just being your the contrast to your greatness with my nothingness. That's that's what I'm here to do.
Good, man. I'm glad that's your spirituality, because that's what it should be grounded in, honestly.
Yeah. So speaking of that, our plan is we're gonna talk about my thesis this week, and then our next episode we'll go over Max's thesis, and then we'll get to pick his brain and see what he's been really thinking and praying and writing about over the last few years as well. So I also have to say before I do want to hear how you're doing, Max, and just kind of catch up a little bit before we start. But I do have to say that our listeners probably will have heard many of the thoughts that I'm going to express in this episode throughout our other episodes in bits and pieces. But this is kind of going to be a coherent presentation of a topic that I've been really interested in over the last few years, and hopefully they find it interesting. Also, if you're new to Logos Podcast, welcome to Logos Podcast. We are super glad that you're here. We continue to be so grateful to all of our donors, our patrons, and our supporters. Thank you so much for your continued help with the project. And we love that it's continuing to bear fruit in people's lives. So we're glad that you're here.
Yeah, for sure. We really thank you guys. In fact, it's funny. We had a little hiccup with our website. People weren't able to log on, help, check it out, and we had a bunch of emails, people telling us, "Hey, update your website. Hey, do this." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you guys." And we just have overlooked it, but we're back on. We're on fire right now, and we're ready to rock and roll. But yeah, man. So there's that. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Check out our former episodes as well. And as you may have noticed, we're only releasing every other week right now, which gives you a little bit of time to catch up if you've been behind. So take the opportunity to do that. It's always helpful for you guys to share and to like our stuff on any platform. So, continue doing that. But aside from that, Diácono José, ¿cómo estás?
Estoy bien, gracias a Dios. That's pretty much the only Spanish that people usually get from me. We're still thinking about doing a Spanish episode one day, so maybe.
Yeah, we still owe the people that, by the way. I was thinking about that the other day.
Maybe we will. But I'm doing well. So I am, as I've shared on the podcast before, living with a group of first-year seminarians this summer, spending time with them. We went out to Colorado, actually, for a 10-day excursion in the mountains. So we camped out in the mountains, and then the first 5 days we were there, we would, do our tent camping, wake up, have breakfast, pray, whatever, and then we drive into town And what we did was there's this tiny little Catholic church out there in Rangeley, Colorado. Shout out St. Ignatius Catholic Church and Father John. He was an awesome guy. They had some carpet that they wanted to replace with wood floors. And so for 5 days, my seminarian brothers and I, led by this priest and our vocations director actually, we tore out this carpet, which was super hard work, and then put in real wood floors in this church. And it was really difficult work, but really fulfilling because we got to actually see the before and after of this little church that looked much more beautiful when we were done with it. And then after we finished up that project, we drove further east into the mountains further east into the mountains. Sorry, I'm directionally challenged
That's true. He is directionally challenged.
As people who know me well know. But we drove further east into the mountains and up higher into a higher elevation and spent time camping and hiking and reading a book and talking about it around the campfire each night. So it was an awesome trip. It was great. That's what I've been up to. And now I'm taking them around our diocese, showing them all the different churches, helping them get to know the history of the diocese that we're in. So my life is hectic right now. It's full of awesome stuff, but I'm loving it. How about you? How are you doing? What's going on in your life?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks be to God. I've been very busy too. Since ordination, it just seems to kind of be a consuming motor. There's a lot of things going on. Homily preps, which people are like, oh, it's just a homily. Dude, like if you actually want to make a good homily, if you actually want to pray with it, it takes time, and it takes not just time, it takes spiritual effort. Like you have to sit and contemplate and talk to our Lord, and that has its own thing. So that's been one thing that's been kind of consuming some of my time. A lot of nursing home runs, hospital runs. I've been helping with the homeless around here with some of the programs in the diocese. Also, like you, familiarizing myself with my home territory. A lot of times we think we know what we're getting into, and we think we know the people that we are, going to serve one day, but that's just not the truth because there's so many people. It's just not the case necessarily. So, been learning some of that. But yeah, man, we're not that far away from returning to seminary actually, which is kind of daunting in a certain way.
I know summer's almost over.
I know. So I was thinking about that earlier today, but it's been good. I did my first baptisms last weekend by the grace of God. Yeah, I just grabbed a random baby. I was like, hey, yo, give me that baby. They're like, wait, no, we already baptized. I'm like, you don't really know that. Just give me that baby. And I just did. I just grabbed some water and, I sprinkled it on the child, obviously as a rite intends. And I did the formula, duh. I'm not a heathen. But, then they called the cops on me. So I don't know what that was about. There's some restraining order thing they sent, that whatever, but that baby is baptized.
Congratulations, that's fantastic.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no, I'm good. So they told me to stop that practice, but not doing that obviously because the gospel says baptize the entire nation. So that's what I'm doing. I'm well on my way. All right, Joey. So before we get into kind of the depth of your paper, I think it's helpful for our listeners to hear what the thesis of the paper is, right? So this will allow a couple of things. First, it'll allow you to articulate kind of concisely what you're defending, but it also, I think, will put into perspective why this matters or why this should matter to people. And I know as a part of your work, you have this famous Supreme Court case from 1992 that helps stand as a kind of a contrary to your defense. So yeah, maybe the title of your paper, the thesis, and then this famous case that you're going to use to argue against.
Yeah. So the title of my paper is The Meaning of Personhood in the Mind of Joseph Ratzinger. So this paper is all about the way that Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, understands what it means to be a person. My thesis that I kind of derive from reading a bunch of Joseph Ratzinger's thought is this, that to him, and I think he's right about this, which is why I'm so passionate about sharing what he wrote, to him, personhood consists in relationship. Okay, so to be a person is to be a creature or a thing that exists in relationship. So personhood and relationship are incredibly closely intertwined realities. You mentioned the Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court case that you alluded to and which I start my paper with is Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So in 1992, the decision of Roe v. Wade, which had been made 17 years earlier, was taken to the Supreme Court, and the court had to decide whether or not they're going to uphold the decision of Roe v. Wade and keep abortion legal in America, or whether they were going to decide that Roe v. Wade was the wrong decision and overturn it. And they ended up deciding in this court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that they were going to uphold the decision of Roe v. Wade, that abortion should still be legal in America. And it's really interesting because in defense of that decision, this is what Chief Justice Kennedy wrote. And this is the quote I start my paper with. He says this: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters," he says, "could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state." So what is Chief Justice Kennedy saying? Well, I think what he's saying is what a lot of Americans and a lot of people in Western civilization nowadays think. He's saying that to be a person is to have the capacity to exercise a radical autonomy. Right? To be a person is to be able to essentially do whatever you want. He says, define your own concept of existence or of meaning or of the universe or of the mystery of human life, right? Like to be a person, this is what Chief Justice Kennedy thinks, and I think this is what a lot of people in American culture think, is to basically be able to do whatever you want. It's to have a radical freedom and independence from anyone else to be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want.
So your thesis is the essence of the human person is to be in relationship, as opposed to what many Americans and people in the Western world think. This American Supreme Court, this Supreme Court case, as a case in point, a radical autonomy. Right, relationship is not essential.
That's right.
To define what a person is. Is that right?
Yeah. So this American kind of understanding of what it means to be a person is very individualistic. It's all about me and what I can do myself and the decisions that I'm able to make by myself. You know, even if that's to kill my unborn child in my womb, I'm still freely acting and therefore kind of fulfilling myself as a personhood, and I'm perfectly within my right to do that. Whereas Joseph Ratzinger is going to say, no, to be a person, you cannot flourish as a person. You cannot be a true person unless you exist in relationship to others and respect those relationships. So the reason that he thinks this, which is interesting, is because, well, let me say this. Joseph Ratzinger arrives at this understanding of the human person by first understanding the three divine persons.
Yeah. So here we're getting into kind of your first chapter, right? The first chapter of your thesis, like, kind of what is the human person historically, or what is even the concept, even the term personhood, right? In the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, and then kind of how it developed in history, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because, as I was saying, he argues that the human person can really only be understood in light of divine personhood. And the reason for that is he says that the very concept of person was used to describe God long before it was used to describe human beings. Right? It was actually through the process of Christian revelation that the entire notion of personhood dawned on the Western mind. And only after discovering the personhood in God, divine personhood, was this term person applied to human beings, right? So this is really interesting. This was fascinating to me because what he's saying is that before Christianity, basically, nobody would have ever looked at a human being and referred to that human being as a person. That concept did not yet exist in the Western mind. You would have called them, the Greek word was like anthropos, which is where we get the word anthropology, right? Which just meant man. But this understanding of personhood did not yet exist. It was only through human beings trying to understand God that this understanding of the concept of person eventually dawned on their mind. And so what I do in this first chapter is I kind of explain the historical process by which God revealed his own personal nature. right? And so what Ratzinger is ultimately going to do is he's going to say, okay, look, if you want to understand the human person, you first have to understand the divine persons, because divine personhood is a more fundamental reality than human personhood. And so this first chapter, I kind of walk through some of the stages of salvation history, talking about how humanity, beginning with the Israelites, the patriarchs and the prophets, and then eventually the people who encountered Jesus Christ, kind of discovered that God was a person.
Yeah. So, okay, in line with that thought process, I thought it was interesting in your thesis how you bring up this example, which we've talked about on the episode in our transparency before, but maybe you can draw out a little bit of this revelation on Mount Horeb of God to Moses, right? Which is kind of one of the central arguments that runs through your thesis, runs through Ratzinger's thought, and also runs through the tradition of the church. So if you could kind of talk about that encounter that Moses had with God on that mountain.
Yeah, so for Ratzinger, this encounter with Moses on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, whatever you want to call it, it's referred to as both in the Bible. This is one of the important stages in the revelation of divine personhood, right? So it was through this encounter that Moses and then therefore the Israelites started to get an understanding of the fact that this God that they were in relationship with was in fact personal, that he was a personal God. And so what Ratzinger says is it's a couple of things are super significant about this encounter. First of all, when Moses encounters God in the burning bush, right, the bush that is burning but is not consumed, Moses goes up to it. He begins a dialogue with God, and they have a conversation. God reveals his name to Moses. Moses says, God sends Moses to the Israelites to tell them that they're going to be freed from slavery. And Moses says to them, well, what am I going to tell them? Like, what God sent me to them? How should I refer to you, Lord? And God says a couple things. First, he says, I am who am. And then he says, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Ratzinger says a couple things about this are significant. First, the fact that God has a name at all is significant, right? Because what is a name? A name is something that allows me to exist in relationship to you, right? So like if I'm walking down the road and I bump into somebody and I just say, hi, how are you? And they say, hi, how are you? We've interacted, but we haven't yet formed a real relationship. Whereas if we stop and I actually ask that person what their name is and they reveal it to me, then all of a sudden we've entered into a relationship with one another.
Yeah, there's a new mode of kind of calling on that person, being able to speak, also being able to listen to what they have to say, right? It's like a kind of a interpersonal reality develops there.
Yeah, exactly. And this is always so funny. I'm in ministry and I'm so regularly encountering people who, and I want to know their names. And if I can remember their names, I can always tell it's very meaningful to them and so I try really hard to remember as many names as I can, but it's because I want to really enter into a relationship with these people. And this is what's happening. This is what's happening with Moses and the burning bush. God is kind of handing himself over to Moses by giving him his name, by disclosing his name to him and saying, okay, I, the Almighty God who have created heaven and earth, I am coming down to your level and giving you my name so that you can call upon me, right? So that you can exist in relationship to me. And this was very significant for Moses. And then Ratzinger also mentions that it was significant that God called himself the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, because a lot of these other pagan gods and the cultures that Israel was surrounded by, like the Egyptians and some of the Babylonians, the pagan gods were just associated with particular sites. So like if you lived in a pagan civilization and you went to a river and it was a super powerful river, you might think that there was a god of the river there. But you would think that the god was kind of confined to that geographical location.
Or on the other hand, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the Eastern religions had this idea of like kind of disappearing into the existence of the all, or like kind of an impersonal spiritual reality, right? So that again, in the Jewish and then Christian tradition, that's different than those positions.
That's right. That's right. But Ratzinger says, no, this God who is revealing himself to Moses and the Israelite people, he's not just a God of some place. He's a God of men. He's a God of your fathers. He's a God who exists in relationship with you and your people and who transcends time and space, but can nevertheless enter into relationship with you. And so even at this point, Moses never would have thought about God and called him a personal God. That word still wasn't kind of in his vocabulary. But what he was discovering and what the Israelite people were discovering over time was that this God existed in relationship to them. Right? And that was significant. That was hugely significant, that they could actually speak to him and that he actually spoke to them. And this was the first step on the discovery on the gradual discovery of divine personhood.
So let's walk into this next section, which I think is at least one of the central points that you have, and for our listeners to hear. So you kind of talked a little bit about kind of the traces in the patriarchs and God's revelation as person to man. But then you walk into the next section, the revelation of divine personhood in Jesus Christ, right? So it may seem like a big step to a lot of people, but as we'll find out, I think it's a very, very, very related point, which, so if you don't mind drawing that out for us.
Yeah. So, of course, I gave a very brief overview of all of salvation history, and as you mentioned, just chose to focus in on a few key moments throughout the Old Testament that God's personal nature was manifested, one of them being Moses in the burning bush. But then really, ultimately, it all culminates in the incarnation of the Lord Jesus, right? Because when the Lord Jesus comes, God, he reveals himself fully. The letter to the Hebrews says, in many and varied ways, God spoke of old through the prophets, but in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And so Jesus is the fullness of God's revelation to humanity. And one of the things that was revealed in the person of Jesus Christ was precisely the reality of divine personhood in general. And so the approach I took to kind of getting at this reality is following Ratzinger is I looked at the different titles that some of the New Testament authors use to describe Jesus, right? Because you have to think about these New Testament authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Apostle Paul, Peter, they're all writing and they're all trying to describe this reality that they've just experienced, this man who has come to them and who they lived for years with. They shared life with him. They saw the way that he lived. And then they watched him die on the cross. They watched him rise from the dead. They saw all of this take place. And then as they get ready, as they're going out to preach the gospel, and they start to write some of these gospels, and they start to write some of these letters, and they're trying to find ways to describe this man. And Ratzinger kind of hones in throughout many of his writings on 4 titles that these evangelists and New Testament writers use to describe Jesus. And he says that each of these titles kind of reveals something to us about the nature of divine personhood.
The first of these is, if I'm not mistaken, that you have on the sections, Joe, if you're ready to go there.
Yeah,
is,
for sure.
The logos or logos or logois or logo or logoi, right? Which is the title of our podcast. And part of the reason I think we chose it in Providence is I think part of the argument that you lay out here, which is, really beautiful. So if you don't mind talking about that section, then I really, like you said, there's 4. The first is the logos. The second is the Son. Third is the one sent. And then last is the one for. So we'll break kind of each one, succinctly down. So the logos first.
Okay, cool. So yeah, obviously the logos, yes, the title of our podcast. Basically, I was just trying to market for us.
Honestly, dude, I got you. I'm going to market the crap out of this. So
just read my thesis, listen to our podcast. That's it.
Boom. Nothing like a logos podcast that talks about the logos, about an MA thesis that has a logos in it. You know what I mean? Easy. I mean, really markets itself.
I should footnote our podcast in my paper. Just be like, yeah, for more information, see Logos Podcast.
Episode 150, whatever this is.
That's right. No, so the logos. So yeah, St. John in the first letter in the first chapter of his gospel, he says, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. All things came to be through the Logos, and without him nothing came to be. And in the fullness of time, the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." Right? And what is John doing? Why did John use this word to describe Jesus Christ? He's describing Jesus Christ. That's what he's doing. Well, logos was a word that already existed. It was already very prevalent in Greek and Stoic and Jewish philosophy.
Particularly Heraclitus, right, in the 6th century, which is what you lay
That's
out
right.
in
That's
the
right.
view,
We think Heraclitus was one of the first guys to use this word, and then it had a later tradition kind of surrounding it. But ultimately what logos meant, and I think we talked about this on our Stoicism episode when we talked about Marcus Aurelius way back when and Stoicism. But ultimately what the logos was, according to the understanding of these Greek philosophers, was it was like the eternal reason that was imbued throughout all of reality. So these philosophers, they looked at the world and they realized that it was intelligible and that it was ordered and that they could know things about it. And so they thought that the logos was kind of like this, like almost the divine mind, right? The rational, intelligible principle that ordered all things and that imbued all things. Now, many of these philosophers thought that it was just this abstract kind of force, or maybe it was a creator of some kind, but it wasn't anything that you could like interact with and relate.
Yeah, it
with.
was like a rational principle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than a person.
Exactly. But John is saying, okay, this thing, the logos that you guys have been noticing as you look at reality, it's true. It does exist, but it's not just some abstract principle. It's this man. It's this person. The logos became flesh. In the beginning was the logos. And with John, you'll notice if you read English translations of John's gospel, the word logos is not translated as eternal reason or rational principle. The word logos is translated as the word. Right? So in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So why word? Why John? So John kind of, by applying this word to Jesus, he kind of transforms its meaning. And now logos doesn't just mean reason, it means word. And why is calling Jesus the Word a fitting description of him? Well, the reason it's a fitting description of him is because Jesus was not only God's messenger to the world, Jesus was himself the message. Right? Jesus, when God revealed himself to humanity, the word that he spoke was Jesus Christ. This is who I am. If you want to know who I am, if you want to listen to my word, all you need to do is look at this man, look into the eyes of this man. He is my word. And you'll notice that a word is always spoken by someone, and it's always spoken to someone.
And for a purpose.
And for a particular purpose. And so the word, the concept of word itself includes within it the concept of relationship. Right? And this is what St. John was saying when he was trying to describe this figure, this man who had become his best friend and his Lord and his master. He was saying, I'm going to use this word logos or word to describe this man because this man was a completely relational person. He was constantly in dialogue with the Father who had sent him, and he was constantly living for the sake of the people to whom he had been sent. He was the Word, he was the Logos, and he was the eternal rational principle that created all things in the beginning and has existed from all eternity. So I think that's the kind of the core of the Logos concept.
Cool. How about we start looking at this other section you had, Christ or the Logos as the Son?
Yeah, so this is, the other word that Ratzinger notices all throughout the Gospels. Jesus calls himself the Son. Sometimes he calls himself the Son of Man or the Son of God. Other times he just calls himself the Son. Why is that title a fitting description for Jesus Christ? And what does it reveal to us about the nature of God and the nature of divine personhood? Well, the Son, if you think about the concept of a son, it's a completely relational concept, right? Like, whenever you have a son, you by definition have a father, right? and in human terms, a mother as well. But like a son is completely unintelligible without the relationship to the father. And when Ratzinger says really that this concept of the son is perhaps the most essential and important description of Jesus. He says this term son, along with its correlate father or Abba, gives us a true glimpse into the inner being of Jesus. Indeed, into the inner being of God himself. He says that Jesus' whole being is nothing other than relation to the Father. So Jesus, this is something that the disciples noticed about Jesus, is that he was somehow, even in the midst of his daily activities, constantly in dialogue, constantly receiving himself, constantly drawing upon the strength of the Father. He was completely and utterly in relationship with the Father and only understood himself as the Son. He proceeded from the Father and was always in dialogue with the Father. And so, you have these strange passages in the Gospel of John where Jesus will say things like, he'll talk about like the Father and the Son are different, right? They're distinct somehow. He'll say things like, the Son can do nothing without the Father. Right? So right there, Jesus is admitting that there's some sort of distinction between the Son and the Father, that the Son is something other than the Father is. But then he also turns right around in the Gospel of John and he says, the Father and I are one. Or he who has seen me has seen the Father. But Ratzinger says that this apparent contradiction is actually solved through the logic of sonship. Jesus is the Son, and he says this. He says, in that Jesus is called the Son and thereby made relative to the Father, the result is that he does not stand in himself. He stands in him, in the Father, constantly one with him. The Son as Son, and insofar as he is the Son, does not proceed in any way from himself, and so he is somehow completely one with the Father. Since he has nothing beside the Father, he claims no special position of his own. He confronts the Father with nothing belonging only to him. So this is the kind of the second aspect of Jesus' personality, which is why St. John, the evangelist, and some of the other gospel writers decided to refer to him as the Son. And this is a relational term.
Yeah, that's awesome. In order to finish up this first chapter, let's quickly talk about these last two sections, and then we can, what I found was very interesting about the actual formulation of the definition of the word person.
Yeah.
Kind of just in historical development. So the first is, let's talk about the one sent, and then the one for. So if you could give it to these kind of summarily.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, the one sent, Jesus says that he has been sent into the world by the Father. And again, this implies a concept of relationship. He's been sent by the Father and he's been sent to humanity. So if you want to understand Jesus, you have to understand him in that capacity. He is essentially related to the Father. He comes from the Father and he exists for the sake of the world. And then that final title, Jesus is the one for, Ratzinger notices this preposition is always used to describe Jesus and his activity. That he says, my flesh is the flesh, the bread from heaven is the flesh that I will give for the life of the world. He says, this is my body given for you, right? This is Jesus' entire being is outpouring himself for the sake of another, for the sake of humanity, for the souls that he wants to save. And he's able to do that because he's constantly drawing from his union with the Father. Right, so that's the basic point there with really those last two titles of Jesus.
And so we see the one sent. He sent what for a mission? What mission? For us, right? To give us life. And how do we see this kind of radical love, this radical personhood expressed, this personal love, on the cross, right? And the institution of the Holy Mass. This is kind of, again, this personal relationship that comes from and towards for man. So. All right, sweet, dude. Awesome. Now let's turn into the last portion of this chapter, and then we'll carry onward. But I just wanted you can briefly talk about this idea of kind of where the word person was also employed. Just to draw out the specific point that I'm talking about, you talk about that the word person was used in Greek theater, right? I thought it was fascinating. I remember one time in class you corrected me on this when we were talking about kind of the development of person, because I think it's fascinating. And as I was reading this paper, I was like, yeah, that's a crazy idea. So do you mind just briefly talking about that, kind of the historical development of the word itself?
Yeah. I love correcting you in class, by the way. It's one of my favorite things.
Okay.
Also, this is really, when I discovered this was kind of the inspiration for the whole paper, because I just find this so fascinating. So even throughout the whole Old Testament, and then even after Jesus Christ lives, dies, rises, ascends into heaven, and then the gospel writers describe him as the Son, the Logos, the one sent, and the one for, they still don't have this word person, right? Like nobody is using this word person to describe human beings or God. Instead, they're trying to like figure out what just happened, right? Like the early church, they're getting together and they're like, okay, we need to be able to understand what we believe so that we can communicate what we believe to the world that we want to evangelize. But there's this weird thing that we just saw of this guy named Jesus, who was a human being, but also claimed to be God and was distinct from the Father, but was also somehow totally one with him. So how do we describe that? How do we make that make sense to ourselves or to the people who are trying to evangelize? And so the early church fathers, they needed to find new words with which to describe these realities that they had just encountered. They were like, okay, the words that we typically use to describe things don't work because this guy, Jesus, just explodes all of the categories that we usually use to describe reality. And so, actually, the first guy to do it was your boy, St. Justin Martyr.
My boy, St. Justin Martyr, no doubt.
Max was ordained on his feast day. He was the philosopher evangelist, and the church father who was a philosopher.
I think, if not the only, one of the few only philosopher martyrs categorized in that way formally in the church, which is what I hope I am. But that's beside the point.
Yeah, it is pretty sweet. That's like one of the coolest titles I've ever heard. So what did St. Justin Martyr do? Well, he saw within Scripture that he was reading and from the accounts of the apostles that he had heard, this weird dynamic of Jesus who was somehow at one and the same time completely united to the Father, but also distinct from him and always in dialogue with the Father. And Justin, in order to describe this, he adopted this word from the Greek theater. Okay, the word was, in Greek, it's prosopon, but it's the word person, right? So at this time in history, again, you never would have looked at a human being and called him a person. The only time you would have used the term person, is when you were describing this thing that actors used in a Greek theater, right? So when two people got up on stage, or even one person got up on stage and was performing a poem, like a dramatic poem in the Greek theater, they would put on a mask to embody a certain character so that they could depict the action of the poem in dialogue, so that I could be one person now, and then I put on another mask and be another person and continue the dialogue in this way. Well, that mask was called a person. That's what the word person meant originally, which I just find so fascinating. So if I wanted to be this character in a poem, I would put on a person. And then if I wanted to be a different character, I would take that person off and put on another person and continue the action of the poem. And so St. Justin, as he's trying to describe Jesus Christ and the three things that he sees are somehow coexisting in God, the Father, the Son, and then this Holy Spirit thing, he's like, I know what word I'm going to use to try to describe this to people. It's almost like they're persons. It's almost like there's these three distinct persons that are in constant dialogue with one another and exist within the one singular God. And so that's what he did. He adopted this word person because it contained within it the concept of dialogue and of relationship. And he used that term to describe the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, here's what's important, though. By applying this term person to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, its meaning changed a little bit. It no longer referred to like obviously a mask that someone puts on, and it no longer referred to three distinct realities, or three separate realities, I should say, because the three persons of the Trinity, they're distinct, but they're not separated. They're united as a part of the one singular Godhead. Now they referred to these divine relations. Okay, so this is the weird insight that St. Augustine came up with. So St. Justin used this word person, and then later Tertullian used this word person, and then finally St. Augustine, he was the first person to really come up with one of the descriptions of the Trinity that we now use as Christians, and that description was this: una substantia, tres persona. One substance, three persons. Right? And for Augustine, God is one substance and three persons, and that's possible because the three persons are relations. Like, that's what they are. Like, the Son is distinct from the Father, not because he's a separate being, it's one being, it's the one being of God, but because he is related to the Father as a son. Right? And the Spirit is distinct from them both because the Spirit flows forth from them both and is related to them in a relationship of spiration, which we don't have to get into. That's what St. Thomas Aquinas will say. But here's the point. Here's the way we understand this, that within God, the Father is not like, he's not like the guy who begets the Son, who like generates the Son. The Father is the very act of generating the Son itself. He is pure relation. And the Son, within the Trinity, he's not like the one who proceeds from the Father. He is the very act of proceeding from the Father itself. The only thing that distinguishes them is relationship. They're distinct by their relations of origin, which is what the later tradition would say, which means that a person in the Trinity, the first time that human beings used the word person to refer to something other than a mask that we used in the theater, was to describe these three divine relations in God.
It's super important because before this, again, friends, starting from kind of the beginning of the episode, the word person wasn't really employed other than, like you said, these dramatic events. I mean, literally dramatic events. Now it's applied. Okay, what does personhood mean? Well, as Ratzinger is arguing, as you articulate in your work, it means it's referring to God first of all, the divine persons.
Yeah, the three divine persons who exist in relationship to one another, who are only distinct because of their relationship to one another, and who are themselves nothing other than divine relations. And so I think this is a good point to transition to chapter 2, right?
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, you can articulate this idea of, being from, for, and with, right? From, for, and with, which is some characteristics you talked about just earlier. And then we'll finish up by kind of, you're using this argument of personhood to then debunk the radical statement proposed by the Supreme Court case.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, very simply, chapter 2, we don't have to spend too much time on, but basically what Ratzinger is saying is, okay, historically, the word person was first used to describe the three divine persons, the three divine relations within God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then it was later applied to human beings because the early Christians recognized that human beings were created in the image and likeness of that God who is three divine persons, right? Like, a human being is a person almost by way of analogy. Like the prime example of personhood is God. Human beings are persons because they're created in God's image and likeness. And so that's why we call them persons, which is counterintuitive today because now when we think of a person, we typically think of a human being. But to the ancient mind, when they thought of a person, they primarily would have thought of God. And so in order to understand the human person, it's necessary to understand what is common between human personhood and divine personhood, right? Like what is it within the human person that makes them to be the type of thing that we call a person when really personhood exists in God? And what Ratzinger says is the thing that exists in human persons is relationship. That human beings are called persons. They are persons precisely because they, like God, exist in relationship to others, right? And he kind of draws upon these three fundamental relationships that he sees as corresponding to the three persons of the Trinity, right? So the Father begets the Son. He pours out himself for the Son. I guess, which one should I start with? From. Let's start with from. That one's easy.
From is a good one.
So the Son within the Trinity, he proceeds from the Father. Ratzinger kind of hones in on this preposition from, and he says that's part of what it means to be a human being. It's to be a being who comes from another. And if you think about it, a human being, you can't understand a human being except as a being from. So like, first of all, you don't exist unless you come from your parents, right? You receive yourself as a gift from another. You don't get to create yourself. So this trend in our culture today that says I get to become whatever I want because I'm the source of myself, and I can become a girl if I want to be a girl, or a guy if I want to be a guy, or a dog if I want to be a dog, or nothing if I don't want to be anything. That's ridiculous because you don't create yourself. You come from another, right? And you come from another because you're created in the image and likeness of God. So you come from your parents, but then you also ultimately come from God himself.
Yeah, because you're a person who also exists in relationships. So you're kind of being made in the image and likeness of God. You're imprinted with the seal of God, which means, again, this relationality that's essential for humanity.
And what it also means, and this is so crucial, and this is almost the most important point in my thesis, is that in order to flourish as a person, I cannot try to become completely independent of other persons. I actually have to depend on other persons for my existence and for my life and for my own flourishing. If I try to do what Chief Justice Kennedy thought was good, if I try to do what many Americans today think is good and just live totally for myself and do whatever I want, I'm not going to be living as a real person because I'm going to be rejecting that relationship of coming from another that is constitutive of my entire being. I have to, in order to flourish, depend on others. And most people hate that.
They do. And just a little kind of, to make the case in point, I've been a part of the AA group here at the parish just to see kind of what it's about, how you found one, who's going there, what they're talking about, how, God willing, as a future priest, I can help with that ministry. And one of the things that they'll emphasize in these meetings is the need for community, the need for a collective goal, because they try to do things on their own. They tried to fix their problems on their own. They tried to be their own saviors. They tried to identify themselves in their own ways, right? Whether it be to avoid their own issues, right, or to solve their own issues. It didn't work. It doesn't work. This is the case for any of us. I think if we take just a brief moment to existentially consider our reality, we'll notice that anything that's gone good in our life, it's probably because of somebody else, because somebody has helped us along the way. And that's, again, as you're pointing, Joey, like the essence of personhood is such that we can't exist apart from others. We're necessarily dependent on others for our identity, our flourishing, and then our freedom as well.
Yeah, and of course there's a childish way of being dependent on others, like not being able to take care of yourself. And we're not saying that a full-grown adult should be like completely dependent on another to like spoon feed him his food every day. But as we've said time and time again, your exercise of your independence as a grown adult always needs to be grounded in a more radical dependence, first of all upon God, and second of all upon the other members of your community. Right? Other members of your family, your parents, like this is essential. And this is actually how we become divine. It's how we become like God. We become like God, which is our destiny, by paradoxically not trying to be strong and independent and autonomous ourselves, but by becoming dependent like the Son, right? This is why Jesus says, unless you turn and become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. You have to become dependent like the Son, and it's precisely in that paradoxical dependence that you are exalted and become divine because you're created in the image of the God who is himself Father, Son, and Spirit.
You share in personhood, if you will, to the extent that you recognize this dependency and that you live in that dependency.
Yes.
Right? Which carries us, I think, well into the next section of the topic, which is a human person reflects personhood to the extent that they give themselves for something.
That's right. So this corresponds to the first person of the Trinity, right? We're created in God's image. So we're like the Son. We come from another, but we also have an image of the Father in us. The Father is completely for, right? He pours out his life. He generates the Son. He gives life, and he pours himself out completely for the sake of another.
But he also generates creation.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a great point. Which means that if we want to become true persons, if we want to flourish as the type of thing that we are, we cannot live completely for ourselves. Right? We can't just be living to try to fill up our own life with happiness and material stuff. Paradoxically, we have to make a gift of ourselves and live for others. Like, this is how we flourish as persons, because we're created in the image of the God who is these three persons. We can't live selfish lives. We have to die to ourselves and live for others. And it's precisely in dying to ourselves that we will rise. This is why Jesus says, unless you lose your life, you will not find it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, right? This is what he means. We actually have to give our lives away in love to others like he did on the cross. And that's how we actually flourish as the type of thing that we are.
And interestingly enough, I know in your thesis you bring up this point, which I thought was fascinating, particularly because I'm writing some work on death. I'm about to murder a few people. And, no, just kidding. I'm helping a group here to talk about death and stuff and dying well. But part of the paradox here is, like, every single one of us listening, each one of us talking, is moving towards death. Like, it is the case that we're doing that. Then we're doing that again, and in another second, and you understand, we're entering into the dynamic of death, but we're also, by the grace of God, entering into the dynamic of life. Right? And so there's this play constantly, which we cannot avoid. Which I think, just to bring that point a little, maybe more intimately, I think that's the case for all of us. Right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So a human being is a person is a being from. He's a being for, and then finally he is a being with, right? A being with other human persons and with the divine persons, right? So this corresponds to the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, this in whose image and likeness we are created. And what Ratzinger basically means here is that you have to exist. You kind of have this horizontal and vertical dimension, right? I come from God and I pour myself out for others, but I also need friends. I also need to exist in real community, in friendship with others. Ratzinger says that the community that we are all destined to exist within is the church. That's the mystical body of Christ into which we're all destined to be united as one family. And this is what we need in order to flourish as persons, as a family, as a community, is to live with others, right? So those are kind of the three fundamental relations that characterize human existence as Ratzinger sees it.
Yeah, that was okay. Again, I think this is a weak thesis. But going forward, last point here. I'm kidding, Joey. He's crying. Deacon Joey's crying. Dude, don't cry.
Sorry, dude. I just
Relax,
get super
bro.
emotional.
Just relax, dude. Okay? Let it go. Let it go, you know? It's not me, it's you. You know? So let's go into this last chapter. I thought, because you conclude it, and it's a short kind of rebuttal, giving your larger argument as a rebuttal to kind of the anthropology of abortion proposed by Chief Justice Kennedy and the courts he presided over. So if you don't mind, just kind of talking about how you, at the end, argue against this, given your large argument here.
Yeah, so basically I say, if you adopt Chief Justice Kennedy's view, which I think is actually the view of the wider American culture, and you think that a human person is going to flourish to the degree that they exercise radical autonomy and independence from other human persons, even to the point of destroying the child within their womb in the name of your own freedom, I think that's not going to lead to your own fulfillment as a person. I think it's going to lead to the destruction of your personhood. Because really, if you want to flourish as a person, you have to live in relationship with others, which means you have to respect the relationship that you have to the child in your womb. In fact, you're probably being called to live for that child who is being called to live from you, right? And you're being called to live with the one with whom you conceived that child, right? That's the natural order of things. Ratzinger says that, again, to be a person is to exist in relationship. And so therefore, this is what's crazy. And this is one of the craziest points. We've made this point on the podcast before. He said that when modern man says that the way towards freedom, the way towards fulfillment is through radical autonomy and independence from God and from other persons, he says that is simply modern man succumbing to the seductive voice of the ancient serpent who tempted Adam and Eve in the garden. Right? This is exactly what Satan tempted Adam and Eve with. He said, take from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what will happen? You will be like gods. What Satan meant is that you won't have to live in relation to anyone. You will be able to do your own thing and decide for yourself what is true, what is good and what is evil, and to be the sole arbiter of truth and the sole arbiter of your own reality. This is what the devil tempts us to do, which is why so many of us fallen human beings are tempted to just try to live completely autonomous lives outside of any relationship to others. It's why we're tempted to just get rid of the child in our womb. Okay, I say in our womb. Of course, hopefully people know that when I'm talking about this harshly, I'm talking about it on a theoretical level, and I have nothing but compassion and mercy and love towards women who are in these situations and considering an abortion. We've talked about this on other episodes. But on this theoretical level, this is kind of how the structure of all of this works. Satan is tempting us always to disregard the relationships that are fundamental for our lives, our relationship with God and our relationship with others, and just try to live for ourselves. And so when Justice Kennedy and American culture argues that no, a woman should be able to destroy the child in her womb in the name of her own personhood, they're just listening to the voice of the ancient tempter, and he's got them. And he's rejoicing every time that we sacrifice one of these children of ours on the altar of convenience in the name of our own freedom, because he's got us. If we want to truly escape from his grasp, if we want to truly flourish as persons, we have to do the opposite of destroying the children in our wombs. We actually have to look at the child who's wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. And we have to learn from him what it means to be a person. He is completely dependent upon his mother and upon his foster father, Joseph. He has nothing of his own. And he is the one showing us what it means to be a person, what it looks like to truly flourish as a person. Not the one who can just do whatever you want, but the one who learns how to be from another, and then from that place of dependence is able to pour his life out in love for others on the cross. This is the other tragedy of abortion, is when a mother sacrifices the child in her womb, she's losing the opportunity to fulfill herself by living for this person, by pouring herself out in love for the sake of this person. And so she's in an effort to grasp and fulfill herself as a person, she's leading to her own destruction and the literal destruction of the child in her womb.
And also, we've been talking about women in this case, but also like the father who, not even father, the man who concedes and supports this act is also destroying himself, destroying the dignity of relationship, of marriage, of the call for love, because he destroys the kind of the icon of human existence, right? Pope Benedict talks about the child as the icon of human existence. He destroys the very thing that shows us what it means to be a person. Right? And in doing so, he destroys his own personhood. And I mean, if I may be so bold, you enter into a hell, right? You begin to worship Satan, right? You begin to enter into this satanic logic, this satanic dialogue. We use, you use this example as a very, very, very big example, a very prominent example of what it means to destroy personhood. But as you make the argument in your paper, Jesus Christ, God, stands as a reflection of what personhood actually means. And in fact, I was reading that book, Dominion, by Tom Holland. Spider-Man writes books now. And, no, I'm just kidding. Tom Holland, an English historian, and he says that the whole idea of like dignity and the respect for persons comes from and is grounded in the Christian tradition. Right. So if you want to argue that Christianity is terrible, you want to argue that Christianity is oppressive, you want to argue that this Christianity sucks and is destroying civilization, you'd be hard pressed to make that argument credibly, because one of the many things the church has contributed to society has been this idea of personhood and the respect for the personhood from conception to natural death. Right? Because we see our necessity to rely on this idea of personhood, which reflects God's personhood.
Yeah, that's so well said. That's such an important point. And I just want to, I guess, close by making one more point that I failed to make as I was kind of explaining this. For Ratzinger, the reason I started the paper with the Kennedy quote and then also concluded with this understanding of abortion is because in Ratzinger's mind, abortion isn't just like one sin among others. He says it's like the fundamental, it's like the most clear explanation or manifestation of the destruction that comes from the modern understanding of personhood, right? If you think of personhood as, if you think of a person as somebody who can do whatever they want, whenever they want, independent of others, it's literally going to lead to your destruction. Like metaphorically to your own, like of your own personality and happiness, but literally to the destruction of your children, which is what's happening in our country. And he says there's a twisted and diabolical logic to the sin of abortion, because you mentioned that the child in the womb it's an icon of human existence, right? It shows us what we in fact are, that we're creatures, that we're dependent on others, that we need others, that we exist in relationship to others. And we, fallen human beings, hate that. We don't like to be reminded that I have to depend upon another and therefore maybe even submit to another in obedience. We don't like to be reminded that I'm not God, that I'm not the sole arbiter of reality, and that I have to respect and love and pour out myself in death for those with whom I'm, in relationships with. And so he says that almost as if to blot out that reminder of our own creaturely dependence, we get rid of the children in our wombs. Like the child in our womb reminds me that I'm a creature and that I'm dependent upon another and that I exist in relationship to others. And I don't like that because I'm a sinner and I want to be God. And so I'm going to get rid of the child in my womb. Now, that's not literally what a woman is thinking as she's going to get an abortion, of course, and that's not what Ratzinger is saying. Obviously, women who are in those situations, they're terrified, they're distressed, they don't know what to do. Oftentimes, they're pressured, and we have compassion for them. But what he is saying is the structure of the sin itself is such that this is how it works. And so, really, I just conclude my paper kind of as I already mentioned. Like, if we want to know what true personhood is, we don't look to Chief Justice Kennedy. We don't look to American culture. We look to Jesus Christ, because he is the one who shows us what it looks like to be man fully alive, which is paradoxically man pouring himself out in love for others on the cross. That is the paradox. That's man fully alive. And it's through that you'll actually experience the glory of the resurrection.
Nice. Good job, Deacon Joey. I'll give it to you. It was all right. I mean, I definitely get somebody to read it, I'm sure. Nobody comes to mind immediately. But no, seriously, you did a good job. I hope you get a good grade on it. I'm sure you will. But guys, I hope you enjoyed that. It was really powerful stuff. Last night when I was reading it, in fact, I was like sitting here praying. I was like, geez, that's big time stuff. I've heard some of these arguments before. And if you tune into Logos podcast, you probably have heard similar lines of thought, because we do rely on Ratzinger for a lot of our stuff. And he's a great theologian. You can't go wrong with him. And I think this just kind of hammers that point all the more home, because in Ratzinger's own life and Pope Benedict XVI's own life, the person of Jesus Christ is the man he worships through and through his work, through his life. And I think this is an attribute in a certain way to him in our own lives. So, yeah, man, that's what I have. I don't know. Any last remarks, Joe?
Yeah, just thanks for letting me do this. This was fun after writing this for years. Hopefully people find it interesting. And maybe after I turn it in, we could publish it and even like put a link to it somewhere so people could read it if they were interested in reading further, because there's plenty in it that I didn't get to talk about today, but that's fine. We've already been going too long.
Yeah, man. Well, guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope you grew closer to the person of Jesus Christ at Logos. And as always, God bless.